We're going to go ahead and get started with our lunch program with William Kristol of the Weekly Standard. I should, beforehand, though, point out that our Providence staff includes 3 people. You've met myself and Mark Levecki, but there's a third Mark, Mark Melton, who is our deputy editor. If you could wave your hand, Mark. So we are collectively the Marks, M-A-R-X, as we know ourselves by, but we relate more to Harpo and Groucho than to Carl, so keep that in mind. And I also should point out that, as it's been alluded to, that a little bit at least, that we are basing ourselves on the magazine that Reinhold Niebuhr founded in February 1941, Christianity in Crisis, in terms of being a journal specifically aimed at a Protestant audience to address issues of war and international statecraft, which Niebuhr continued to summon the largely pacifist Protestant denominations to pay attention to the world beyond America. And he continued that work through World War II and into the early years of the Cold War, and was largely successful in that project through the mid-1950s. And unfortunately, as he lost his health and became less active with the magazine, and the magazine lurched off into more disturbing directions, and then mercifully shut down about 20 years ago. So hopefully we will not follow that trajectory, and we'll leave a stronger legacy. But in that regard, Bill Kristol is here to give us a guidance and counsel, having founded the Weekly Standard now, I believe, 20 years ago now, and been an incredible success, and someone who is not himself evangelical, but understands the importance of evangelicals in America and in American politics, and why healthy America needs an evangelical and Protestant population that is thinking in constructive ways about foreign policy and national security. So I know that we're going to benefit from his wisdom. Bill, thank you for being here.
Well, thanks, Mark. It's congratulations on the first issue. It looks terrific. I look forward to reading all of it. I skimmed through some of it. I told one of the Marks, it's great having your editors have all having the same first name. It's extremely convenient for correspondence, you know. You can reject pieces and just sign it Mark, and then the author won't know who to blame. I have to think about that at the Weekly Standard, you know. So everyone there will be William Starr, William Barnes, William Ferguson. That'll be make life a lot easier. Anyway, I was telling one of the Marks that congratulations on the first issue, but of course, the first issue is the easiest issue, I've got to say, based on my experience at the Weekly Standard. You get all your friends to write for you. People are honored to be in the inaugural issue. Second issue, there's still a few friends left, maybe, who didn't make it into the first issue, so you prevail upon them. It's like the third issue is the real crunch time, when you realize, oh my God, I can't make these people write another piece, and now we have to hope that actually people have seen the first issue or the second issue and volunteer pieces. So I'm sure that will happen, but I'm just reporting that I remember this at the Weekly Standard, you know, especially with the Weekly. We worked so, you know, it was a big deal, kind of a big deal. So we worked so hard in the first issue, and you put so much thought into it too. You know, what mix of pieces do you want to have? And you kind of put it out. In our case, that we now close Thursday night, but in those days we closed Friday night. So we closed at the end of the week, and then we sort of showed up in the office the next Monday. This was almost exactly 20 years ago. And it's like, oh my God, we have to put out another issue this week. And as I say, we still had enough stuff left over that we hadn't used in the first issue that it wasn't that bad. But then there was the third issue, and that was when people had nervous breakdowns. But don't worry about it. It'll be great. You're starting the magazine in the right year. I was struck by this because, which is to say a year ending in 5. Because we started 20 years ago, but I was brought home to me that amazing number of successful magazines started in years ending in 5. Commentary just had a 70th anniversary symposium. I recommend it, actually, on Jews, Judaism, Jewry, Jewish future. So they started 70 years ago, so what's that, 1945. National Review famously just had a 60th anniversary symposium, which is also quite good, actually very good. Some very interesting little essays on what books influence people the most. And so Bill Buckley started that in 1955. The Public Interest started 50 years ago. It's a very good piece in National Affairs, the successor magazine, on the first issue of the Public Interest, which was, I think, the fall of 1965. And we started in 1995. So it's so far been, Public Interest closed after 40 years, but after a very distinguished run, and has succeeded very ably by National Affairs. So it's so far pretty good luck to begin in a year ending in 5. So I want to not to engage in pagan superstition and, you know, giving auspicious meanings to year numbers and stuff. But I do want to report that. Advice, people said I should give you some advice. I have no real advice. It will turn out differently from what you expect. That's generally the case in life, and it's certainly the case in magazines. If you think of the magazines I mentioned, none of them now is quite what, I mean, I think most of the founders of them would be proud of what they have become and what they've done over the years, but they didn't have a smooth path doing exactly what they thought they were going to do. Commentary, most obviously, is quite different from what it was originally, and certainly what it had been in the early mid-60s. But even on public interest has started in '65, a moment where there were hopes for a sort of time for a centrist, sober, kind of realistic social science informing public policy as government came to do more things. If you look at the introductory little essay written by my father and Dan Bell to the first issue of the Public Interest, there's no sign that 3-4 years from now they're going to be in the middle of big kind of political fights and almost culture wars, that they'd be in, that things would go the way they did in the late 60s and early 70s. Weekly Standard in '95 started at the time right after the Republican victory in '94. A lot of talk about a new Republican governing agenda, time really to make conservatism not just an ideology of protest, but a governing philosophy. And of course, Republicans have been out of power for most of the time since the Weekly Standard was founded. And to the degree we were thinking about a governing agenda, we were thinking more about domestic policy, because that was kind of the challenge, it seemed, of '94, '95. Foreign policy, Cold War was over. There wasn't even that much partisan dispute about foreign policy when we started. Our first foreign policy editorial was supporting Bill Clinton's intervention into Bosnia. Lost about a quarter of our subscribers right away, who said they did not subscribe to the Weekly Standard to read editorials supporting Bill Clinton. You know? But then there's 9/11, and we end up becoming much more focused on foreign policy than domestic policy for at least a few years. And as I say, it's not as if Republicans have been governing for most of the time since we started. I hope that's not a causality there. But so things do not work out the way you expect, and you'll have different challenges. I mean, just both intellectually and in terms of just producing a magazine. You know, we started right on the cusp of the internet really going big scale public. I remember dutifully when we started the magazine, we had a couple of young interns or, you know, very junior employees go out and buy huge sets of reference books for our conference room, which we had bookcases on the walls of, because that's how magazines used to work. You've got to fact check things, and you need to have all kinds of encyclopedias and almanacs and other, you know, ways of making sure you're putting out a correct magazine every week. We had people who'd worked at Time and Newsweek and various newspapers who were able to say this is kind of what you need. And of course, 3 or 4 years later, we were giving it away to some public, you know, school in inner city Baltimore, because everyone, of course, is checking things online. And we thought the rationale for the Weekly Standard originally was very important to have a weekly conservative magazine out of Washington, print magazine. There were only print magazines then. Again, 5-6 years later, the weekliness of the Weekly Standard started to become much less important, though I think it's still interesting and important in some ways. And we obviously started to have a website and daily postings and a daily Standard in effect. And so things do change technologically and in terms of audience, as well as ideologically and intellectually in ways that you can't anticipate. All you can do is try to have a good group of contributors, of staff, adjust to the times, try to have something interesting to say. In a way, I would say my advice would be don't get too stuck on what you originally thought the magazine should be, because the world changes. And I'll give you an example. Someone asked a couple of questions were asked about Rand Paul, non-interventionism, or anti-interventionism, that threat. There was a lot of talk about that a year and a half ago. I myself always thought that was overstated. But the fact is, I don't think, right now at least it does not, I mean, this was only a year and a half ago, Rand Paul was thought to be the new story in the Republican Party. Huge discussion of this. Mainstream media was hoping it would happen, I think. Rand Paul and his supporters were hoping it would happen. I wouldn't say that's exactly been the story of the presidential race so far. He's still on the main stage debate, but barely. And I don't think Rand Paulism, or even that kind of isolationism, is actually likely to be as strong as everyone thought just a couple of years ago. Now, I would say there are other things that will emerge. In fact, Donald Trump, doesn't exactly have a coherent foreign policy agenda, probably, but to the degree he says things, it's a much more Pat Buchanan-like Fortress America, sort of, we need to be super tough, and we need to bomb people we don't like, but all this nation building, of course, is gone, and all the kind of sense humanitarian intervention, that's ridiculous. So there's a kind of tough-minded pseudo-realism of the right that I think Trump and some others have tapped into some, and I suspect it may be, and I don't know, that 2 or 3 years from now, you all at Providence will be finding more need to educate people away from that than to educate people away from Rand Paul type views, or others, or some combination of the two. So it's very hard to predict history, very hard to predict intellectual trends, and the key is to, I think, have a openness and flexibility to sort of learning from events and learning from what happens. I mean, the Weekly Standard, everyone now thinks very focused on the Middle East, Iraq, we've done a lot on that, obviously, since 9/11, some before, but someone went back and counted up the number of articles we had on China, East Asia, and issues raised by that from 95 to 01 compared to Middle East-focused issues, much more in China. If you had looked at the Weekly Standard in early 2001, you would have said these guys are sort of obsessed with the notion that the Chinese liberalization may not go as well as people think, that economic liberalization doesn't lead to political liberalization necessarily, that it's worth having a human rights and religious liberty, actually, agenda with respect to China. We've done a lot on that, and not so much, honestly, on the Middle East itself. I think we were right. Maybe we were prematurely right about China. The liberalization went pretty smoothly for the next decade or so, more than we expected. Now maybe some of what we wrote 15 years ago actually looks pretty prescient. So one really doesn't know, and one shouldn't presume. My main advice would be one shouldn't presume too much to know what the world is going to look like. If you have a coherent point of view, if it's a well-informed point of view, if it's historically and philosophically grounded, if it's not just based on, I don't like this thing that's in the headlines today, and I'm going to develop a whole theory of why we should be against it, but it's the opposite. You have the historically and philosophically grounded point of view, and then you use that to understand current events, you'll be fine. But the actual current events, the actual thinkers that one focuses on can change pretty radically. I went back and looked at some of the early issues of the Standard, thinking about this a little bit a couple of days ago. The thinkers who seemed important, and even in the academy, even sort of almost political philosophy types, are not necessarily the thinkers who seem important today. I don't know if it moves more quickly or less quickly in theological circles and in Protestant and evangelical circles, but I suspect some of the same thing will happen. And one of the jobs of a good magazine, obviously, is to resurrect thinkers who are a little bit out of favor, either out of favor or just not well known. And there I think you have an extremely important role to play. I mean, I just listening to the discussion on the panel before, Paul Ramsey has always been a huge favorite of mine, not just the stuff on war, actually, but much of the bioethics and other issues. It's been a long time since I've read him with anything close to the care he deserves, but that is not a name that one hears much these days, and it would be great if one heard it more. Niebuhr, sort of. David Brooks did a little bit to contribute to maybe a very minor Niebuhr revival, but I suspect that sort of has faded. There are other thinkers who I don't know. It's not a tradition I know very well, really, at all. Other thinkers, I'm sure, who are very important, who are much more obscure. Maybe people who influenced Niebuhr, who were influenced by Niebuhr, maybe who weren't in New York, in America, and therefore, but were in Britain or Germany or elsewhere, and who are very much worth reading. And of course, then there are the philosophic antecedents of these thinkers. So one thing a magazine really can do without hitting people over the head with it is bring back to light thinkers and statesmen and practitioners who are worth studying. I think that's really true in the subject area that you're focused on. If Christianity and foreign policy, or let's just more broadly say morality and foreign policy. People do treat that as if that's something that no one thought about until people started writing big fat books on just war theory, or no one thought about until they had the terminology that we now have to discuss it, or until people had to take mandatory courses on it at West Point or the Naval Academy or whatnot. But earlier statesmen and thinkers did think a lot about these issues, actually, and you can learn a lot by reading them and thinking about them. And that would be I think it'd be good to break people out of the kind of presentism that really dominates so much of our talk. Bush oversold democracy in the Middle East, and therefore we have to give up on that idea and sort of accept everything. And it's as if no one's thought seriously about the question of how one improves things abroad without being utopian about it, as if the British Empire didn't. The practitioners of the British Empire thought about it, and the people who argue, and the theorists of it, and Macaulay, John Stuart Mill, they're very, very sophisticated debates. What should they do in India? What's it appropriate for them to try to do? How much could they accomplish? Should they just be very, as long as British interests were fine, let them kind of kill each other sort of attitude? Should they civilize these countries, as they would have put it back then? Tocqueville has a very interesting discussion of this, actually, with respect to the Arab world. Some of his writings in the 1840s and before he was foreign minister, actually, for the 6 months or something that he was foreign minister in 1848. So there's a lot you could do, I think, that would be interesting to bring back those works and those thinkers. I would say generally at the Weekly Standard, for whatever it's worth, at first we were sort of wary of too much of that because you kind of assume people are subscribing, especially to a weekly like ours, for current analysis of current events. Turns out people are quite interested, though, in these thinkers they've heard of but haven't had a chance to read, or thinkers whose main work they might have read, Democracy in America, let's say, but they didn't realize Tocqueville wrote very interestingly about foreign policy and about empire and about democracy abroad and democracy in Islam and so forth. And people are grateful, I think, to have those kinds of issues brought back to the fore and explained. And you don't have to do you can say this is very interesting and here's some things Tocqueville wrote and here's what people have said about it. Other people can then follow up and do their own reading. You don't have to sort of, be encyclopedic. A lot of what a magazine does is point towards things, it seems to me, that are worth reading, worth thinking about, without necessarily elaborating on them. In fact, Fred Barnes, my colleague, always says, one of the successes of a small magazine is that people start writing about the topics you raised, or in the way that you raised them, or with a particular aspect of a topic that you focus on, and you've been successful when they stop after the first or second time they write about it. If you're lucky, the first or second time they write about it, they'll say, this was originally discussed in the Weekly Standard, or they'll quote a piece, Andrew Ferguson in the Weekly Standard said X, and by the third or fourth time they're writing about the same person or topic or theme, they forget, of course, where it began, and it just becomes part of the general discourse. So one of the marks of success of a small magazine especially is that people don't cite it as much as they should because it becomes so widespread, the issues that they're trying to raise. Everyone here referred to people being bugged by reality or not being bugged by reality, which was great, but you didn't have to cite, the particular source of that, which I guess was allegedly, the oral tradition has it, that the source of that is a quip of my father's in the early 70s. I don't believe it was actually written down at the time that a neoconservative was a liberal who was bugged by reality, but it's just become part of the lexicon, and a very useful part of the lexicon. I do think in terms of the magazine and in terms, and I'll just say a word about the substance, about foreign policy, and especially, so my father said this in I think it was the early 70s, a young friend of his who died quite young, unfortunately, Mike Scully, who actually edited a very good magazine, which some of the older people in this room might remember, This World, which was kind of a precursor to First Things, right? And so Mike, but he was at the Public Interest too for a while, several years. I can't remember exactly how this came up, but Mike was reviewing, I think, some books or essays or articles by people who were called in the early 80s neoliberals. So they were people who were more sophisticated than late 60s, early 70s liberals about the limits of what government could do. They had read articles by James Q. Wilson and others, Pat Moynihan and so forth. They were a lot more hard-headed, allegedly, but they wanted to stay liberals. They didn't want to become, God forbid, conservatives or neoconservatives or vote for Reagan or something like that. And so they were neoliberals, and they had a big, elaborate explanation of how you could be a neoliberal, learning the lessons of the failures of the Great Society, for example, without going all the way to something dreadful like Reaganism. And Mike Scully reviewed a series of these books and essays and quipped that if a neoconservative was a liberal who was mugged by reality, a neoliberal is a liberal who's been mugged by reality and refuses to press charges. Which is really a very deep point, actually, I would say. And I've found in general, in intellectual life and in political life, and people alluded to it on the panel, that people, if you're smart, you are going to be sort of mugged by. Very few people can make themselves so oblivious to reality that they don't sort of adjust. And certainly if they're politicians or public intellectual types, they sort of have to adjust almost because they just become irrelevant if they don't adjust. But so it's not that hard, sort of, to get people to acknowledge reality, at least to some degree. Some areas may be harder than others. What's hard is getting people to really think through the implications and consequences of that reality. So it's sort of like the stealth pacifism of people. I'm not a pacifist. I think when appropriate and necessary, and when fully worked out and justified, of course we should use force. It's just never quite appropriate, necessary, and sufficiently worked out and justified, et cetera. I mean, there's a lot of that, it seems to me, these days as well, especially in foreign policy. A lot of people who don't want to sound childishly naive or utopian. It's not the 90s. You don't hear people talking about the new Middle East the way, say, Shimon Peres did in the mid-90s. You don't hear people talking much about how if the U.S. would pull out of being involved in world affairs, things will just go swimmingly and people will get along fine. But you do hear, I think, the more sophisticated sort of version. Oh, I understand that it's tough, but here's why we still can't do anything, or here's why strong U.S. would still be counterproductive, or moral leadership, as well as in conjunction with paying attention to our interests, that would be a mistake. And look, those things have to be debated. Sometimes it is a mistake, but presumably. But I do think the refusal to press charges is something one has to call people on, and that means being pretty specific, pretty historical, as one of the pieces in the issue mentions. Less Hegel, more history. I'm sympathetic to that. Less Hegel, period. I'm sympathetic to that. That's unfair to Hegel, who was a very, very great thinker. I vaguely remember from studying and teaching even once or twice when I was much younger. But I'd say more history, more reporting, more reality. At some point the abstract debates kind of rut. If the abstract debates are good debates, at some point they require an engagement with actual reality. You are going to have to say, was this intervention justified or not? Not in theory, interventions can sometimes be justified and sometimes not, and it depends on the circumstances. Well, thanks, but this will give us some examples of circumstances and not just hypotheticals the way academic moral philosophers like to do. So I'm generally a fan of I myself study political philosophy, so I'm interested in reading about political philosophers and reading political philosophy, but I think in general, especially in this field, there's probably a little too much sort of philosophizing, if I can use that term, or moralizing, or anti-moralizing for that matter, and maybe not enough getting down to details and really seeing what it is to think through seriously in a morally serious, in a morally realistic way. A real challenge, and that's where history can be fantastic. I mean, really going back in real time and trying to say, well, what did people know? How could they have thought about it? How should they have thought about it? That's a very illuminating, I think, effort and exercise. You all know much, infinitely more than I do about Christianity and foreign policy, since I'm certainly no expert on Christianity, the Christianity part of it at least. I do think you had a Q&A discussion about whether it's really just about Protestants and evangelicals, or Catholics and Jews get to come into, and even an atheist. Everyone was very shocked when that was mentioned from the panel. I guess from my point of view, I do think that the bigger topic is morality in foreign policy, and I guess I would encourage you. You all have a real work to do in a particular faith community, and I understand that, and that's extremely important. But I do think you'll quickly find. People will quickly find that to the degree you're publishing important things, it's a good course of interest beyond that particular community, and the broader topic of morality and foreign policy, morality and politics even, has to be addressed, and the pieces in this magazine in Providence will be illuminating for that. So I look forward to reading more broadly about morality and foreign policy, and I do think the debate has been a little simplistic in the last 10, 15 years, partly because politicians are going to be simplistic, and I don't even think it's a fair criticism of politicians to say, oh, they overpromised a little, or they were a little simple-minded in saying he committed these horrible crimes, or there's genocide, so we have to intervene. Sometimes academics have this attitude, unless the president or the national security advisor himself walks you through a Ramsey-level complicated analysis of everything, that he doesn't get to sort of assert conclusions. That's really not how politics works in a democracy. It's not how politics works anywhere, probably. That doesn't mean that the people thinking it through don't have to genuinely think it through, and that the critics shouldn't think it through. I do think what's happened in the last 15 years is less that the politicians haven't thought things through. I think actually to a remarkable degree they've been very sensitive to these issues and pretty sophisticated on both sides of the debate, I would say, about the complexities of trying to have a morally informed and morally realistic, but also hard-headed foreign policy. I mean, someone asked the question about who in the executive branch is dealing with these things, and I don't know that it's appropriate to mention, particular names, but it's not the general attitude towards policymakers. I'd say towards military, especially senior military officials, is they're just. I mean, they're running around crazily busy, that's true, and never sort of thinking at all seriously about the challenges they face, which isn't really true. I would say the military officers I've talked to, especially the senior ones, have thought much more seriously and deeply about this than most of the academics who patronize them. So I actually don't think the problem is much on the practitioner side. I mean, they may get things wrong, but they're trying to be serious about it. The problem is on the sort of commentator side and the academic side, which actually has been weirdly more simplistic in some ways than the practitioners who actually understand the complexity of these matters. And so to the degree you can really shake that simplicity up. Pat Moynihan had, I think there's a phrase from Burkhardt or someone. Moynihan used to love to cite this about the terrible simplifiers. And I think there's some of that going on, especially in the areas of morality and foreign policy on both sides. Some moralists oversimplify, and then the critics of the moralists oversimplify with attacking a cartoon version of the moralists, and then everyone thinks they've had a really sophisticated debate. When one person gets to say, hey, you can't have Jeffersonian democracy in the Muslim world, and the other person says you don't care about anyone's human dignity, and then they decide they've had an excellent panel, and they go off and have a nice dinner at some university faculty club. I mean, it's a little embarrassing, really, the level of discourse, and as I say, lower in my experience, having done a little bit in both worlds, than the actual level of thinking that goes on among serious people who are in government or have been in government. So I really hope the magazine can recomplexify this issue without muddying it up, of course, in a serious and lively way. And I'd say, judging from the first issue, which looks awfully impressive, I think you're off to a terrific start. But why don't I stop there and 20 minutes, I don't know, comments, questions? Questions, I can't.
Bill, would you say a little bit more about your sense that the sort of libertarian isolationism is already on its way out? I hang around with a lot of college-age people, so I hope you're true, but...
Yeah, I could be overly optimistic, or I could be making the mistake that I said other people that we all make, which is interpreting 1 year or half a year's trend as somehow meaning, because the fact that Rand Paul isn't doing well doesn't prove that this isn't a deeper trend. I agree. People I know who, I spent a fair amount of time with in colleges and universities, and we hire people, right out of college, so they tell me what's going on. I think it is stronger among younger people. Whether it really is stronger or whether it's just kind of something they can latch onto and it seems plausible, I don't really know. And so anyway, so I may be just wrong. First of all, I'll stipulate that. It may come back in a big way as a kind of principled non-interventionism or anti-interventionism. It seems to me in the world as it is and as it's likely to exist for the next few years, no matter what happens in the election, I'm going to caricature by saying that Pat Buchanan, Donald Trump, but the sort of hard-headed, somewhat even willing to be nasty kind of realism is more likely to be the alternative to a kind of morally informed internationalism or interventionism. And there were two or three versions of that, obviously. There's kind of liberal internationalism, conservative internationalism. I think Trump is onto something when he says, on the one hand, make America great again. So patriotic, nationalist, actually, strongly nationalist America. And we're getting out-negotiated. We're signing stupid deals. We're not standing up for our businesses. So a very strong nationalism, which leads to some willingness to exert U.S. power around the world. Certainly, he's allegedly going to do all these tough trade deals. Not much willingness to use force, it doesn't look like. Not that Trump has detailed this in a very thorough way. But actually a willingness to sort of say it's great if Putin just kills a lot of people from a lot of ISIS, and if he kills a lot of people who aren't in ISIS, who really cares? Trump implicitly says, because, who cares about those people? They're all killing each other anyway. So I'm not going to cut a bad Iran deal. I may bomb Iran, but I'm certainly going to get out of any kind of counterinsurgency, nation building, humanitarian intervention, God forbid, stuff in the Middle East and maybe elsewhere. So I kind of feel, on the right at least, that that is more likely to be the alternative to what I will call oversimplifying, Reagan-Bush kind of internationalism. And I think on the left, the truth is, Obama is more that way. As on a left-wing version, Obama's a pretty hard-headed and, I would say, hard-hearted. I don't want to make a personal judgment on him, but his policies are pretty hard-hearted. At the end of the day, Obama is willing to say, 250,000 people dead in Syria, worth it, because you know what, we probably won't be able to help the situation, and anyway, I don't want to send U.S. troops there. That's his real policy. His real policy is not, gee, I'm really surprised. I thought it was all going to work out and John Kerry's diplomatic missions were going to work. Obviously, he'd like it to work out. He's not a horrible person. I mean, he'd like it if things could be done. But basically, the default is we don't want to get our hands dirty. But not out of moral punctiliousness, just out of, we got a lot of nation building to do here in the U.S., and we're war weary, right? So I guess I personally think the war weariness problem is probably greater. That becomes an excuse then for not doing anything. So a kind of selfish realism, I would say, I think, but obviously who knows, might be more of a threat to what I think most people who contribute to your magazine and to my magazine, our magazine, would think, probably more of a threat than a kind of woolly-headed utopian idealism right now. There's some of that, but I think a little less of that than of just kind of, it's too difficult, it's too hard, the American public doesn't want to do it, it's politically unprofitable to try to do it, and so let's not do it, but let's occasionally deplore stuff that happens and launch a cruise missile or a drone strike or maybe deploy 50 people to 50 special ops soldiers to Iraq or something like that, or Syria or something like that.
Just a quick question. How do you see Christian political engagement changing or evolving in the near future? Next.
Question. I will first default to my earlier statement that these things are extremely hard to predict. I mean, really, if you had predicted at different stages in the 20th century, let's just say, the last 100 years, just on this topic, Christianity and politics, I think you would not have been predicted in 1910. There are people in this room who know much more about this than I do. The evangelical retreat from politics that happened after, whatever it happened after the Scopes trial, something like that. You would not have predicted, certainly in the 30s, one would not have predicted the Niebuhrian turn. Now, one wouldn't have predicted, presumably, Hitler and everything else, too. So I was old enough to remember the 70s. I was in college and grad school. I don't think a lot of people were really predicting the moral majority and Reagan's embrace of sort of politically active Southern Baptists and then subsequent, efforts of Christian religious conservatives in the Republican Party. Again, in 1976, religious, for the first time in a long time, a politician emerged at the national level who wore religion on his sleeve, and that was Jimmy Carter, a Democrat. And we all look back and think, well, that was a bizarre anomaly, and that was obviously just like a weird thing that happened once, and obviously the future was going to be that they were all going to be Republicans. That was not obvious at the time, and I'm not sure it was obvious. I'm not sure it is obvious in retrospect. It just happened that different people made different choices, and the Democratic Party went in a very secular direction, and the Republican Party went in a very different direction. So it's a long way of saying I think it's very hard to know. I do feel like it's a time of flux and uncertainty. I'm thinking of it this way. You have a Republican race in which the two leading candidates right now, leaving aside all the other bizarre aspects of the fact that the two candidates have never held public office and would seem not to be the likely nominees of either party. It's been a long time since either party has nominated someone who hadn't held elective office before. The last time was 52 with Eisenhower, and he'd had a fairly major public office and role before that, so he has to go way back to Wilkie, and then, it was the one actual post-Cold War, Civil War, actually, case, I think, of two, of someone who really hadn't held elective office or a cabinet office, or having been a general officer, being nominated by either party. So the fact that Trump and Carson are the front runners is, of course, bizarre in several ways. But one of the ways in which it's bizarre, they're lumped together by the press, but they're totally different on this criterion of religion and politics, right? One, Carson is quite seems quite religious, is quite religious. His appeal is not, I would say, over the top religious. I mean, it's not as religious as Pat Robertson's or something like that, but it is nonetheless, I think, a lot of it based on a sense that he a deep attachment to Judeo-Christian values and so forth. Trump is the opposite. I mean, for all of his trying to attack Carson for being a Seventh-day Adventist and saying he's just a mainstream Presbyterian, whatever that is. You all can explain that. Well, you all can explain that better than I can. Trump is, so that I think shows how weird a situation it is, though, right? These two are like the front runners. They sort of have something in common, people think, because they're both outsiders, but they're totally different sociologically and culturally. Trump is fantastic when they remember he said that. Well, this before the Seventh-day Adventist thing was later when he decided to sort of slander, really, Carson for that. But earlier on, he had claimed to be he had showed up, I guess, it was in Mississippi, and paid tribute to Billy Graham, and I think he brought the Bible with him, or a Bible with him. I guess he was staying in the hotel, so he had the Gideon Bible, and so he had a Bible, and that was his favorite book. It's even better than The Art of the Deal, and he went on in his way in a somewhat amusing way about this. And so Mark Halperin and John Heilemann, who were very sophisticated political reporters, have this show on Bloomberg, and they thought they had kind of a gotcha for him I think it was early the next week. So, well, Mr. Trump, you cited the Bible and how much it means to you. It's even a better book than The Art of the Deal. What's your favorite Bible verse or passage or, episode, story, whatever you want to say? And you could see for a second, I thought, if you watched it, I didn't see it live, but I watched a sort of, a snippet of it afterwards. You could see that Trump was a little startled. It's a clever question, and it's not one you would necessarily think of, I think, if you're getting ready for an interview on politics. But he's a very quick, thinker, Trump, and thinks on his feet very well. And he said something like, I can't, it would be inappropriate to specify one. So many people, so many different parts of the Bible mean so much to so many different people that I don't even want to just, say. It's a very private matter, It's like, and so Halperin's rolling his eyes, and, but realizes Trump had done a good job of undercutting his gotcha questions. So Heilemann says, which is pretty clever of Heilemann, then says, well, give us at least Old Testament or New Testament. And Trump, again, hadn't really expected that follow-up. I think thinks for just a second, says, both. They're both great. Both fantastic. Then he's so that's one of the leading candidates in the party that's allegedly the serious religious party in the U.S. So who knows, right?
Hello, I'm Cheryl Wettstein with the Washington Times. Hi.
Oh, okay.
There we are. You mentioned in your talk that a publication like Providence could bring back to light practitioners and statesmen and thinkers. Turning to diplomacy, are there any savvy diplomats or diplomatic strategies that you would expect to fit into this?
Well, I think, if you go back and look at just recent American history, there have been pretty interesting and sophisticated debates. I'd say détente, the debate over détente, human rights, the kind of Scoop Jackson versus Kissinger, Reagan versus Ford and Kissinger. The Reagan plank at the '76 Republican Convention, which was Reagan, of course, didn't win the nomination, but I think that he won this fight on the platform because the Ford forces were scared to fight. They thought they couldn't hold their own delegates on this. It was a criticism of Kissinger, I think by name, actually, and of détente, certainly by name. And the title of the plank was Morality and Foreign Policy, which is very interesting. And it was very potent, incidentally. It's puts the lie to the usual stuff about how voters only care about their pocketbook and economic issues always dominate. I mean, Reagan in '76 almost wins the Republican nomination after losing the first 9 primaries by running on the Panama Canal Treaty, which was not itself probably the most important foreign policy issue of the moment, but sort of Reagan skillfully used to sort of signify a broader question of American retreat. But then he does go after Kissinger very straightforwardly on the moral blindness of détente, the refusal to have socialists into the White House in '75. Going back and really looking at those debates, it's not like Kissinger hadn't thought a lot about this. And in fact, Neil Ferguson's new biography of, I guess, Kissinger through '68, I think it is, I haven't read it, but I gather goes into some depth on the amount that Kissinger wrote about this, which is more complicated than the usual cartoon version of Kissinger, I would say. He'd studied political philosophy as a young man and was in some weird way kind of a Kantian who then thought, well, the real world can't be Kantian, so we have to be very hard-headed, but it's not clear where they ever bridged the gap between sort of realism and morality. But so I think the level of those debates is pretty high, though. And the level of people who came out of those debates, Sharansky's writings, I think, are pretty sophisticated, and obviously many others at the time and subsequently. So that's just a recent instance in American history. The British were very preoccupied by this. Who's on the moral side of the Disraeli-Gladstone fight? I mean, you know, it's not so obvious. You know, there's a kind of there's a moralistic imperialism in Britain. There's a moralistic Little Englandism, which is anti-imperial because you get your hands dirty and you have to deal with all these people with bizarre habits and religions, and what are you going to do? You're not going to convert them all, but you're just going to let them live, and you're going to kind of have responsibility for them without worrying about letting them do things that by their lights, the British lights, were not appropriate and not very, not morally, correct. I mean, those are pretty high-level debates. I mean, it's been years and years since I looked at any of them, but I remember looking a little bit at the time in the 19th century. And so I think most serious countries, most serious statesmen, most serious commentators, at least in the modern sort of period, have thought about this. The founders are very interesting on this. You know, and again, a lot of it cuts the opposite way from what everyone thinks. You know, so it's the Jacksonians, the great tribunes of democracy, who were really horrible on Native Americans and blacks, and these sort of aristocratic Whigs who actually are much more concerned. I mean, who really think it's terrible what Jackson is doing, and yet it's somehow then. Arthur Schlesinger writes, you know, when he wants to appropriate American history for the New Deal, sort of retrospectively writes this fawning biography of Jackson. So, I mean, a lot of that stuff would be interesting. I mean, it's not quite, well, I guess it is foreign policy, the Indians. A lot of that stuff is quite interesting, I think. Anyway, I think there's a lot of, serious, I mean, if you're a little power who's sort of a victim of history, you can write eloquently about this and elegiacally, I guess, about it, but it is the kind of, by definition, almost the great powers or the people, the nations that have choices to make about whether or not to intervene, whether or not to use force, what kind of force to use, how much force is legitimate to try to win a war more quickly, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki type decisions. It's the great powers that tend, I think, to have to confront these issues more, which isn't to say that someone from Switzerland or, you know, Slovenia couldn't write a brilliant essay or book on this. It's just in terms of the actual debate, it tends to be in countries like that. Israel, I think, as a serious power, has had to really consider these issues. There's very recently a group of American generals went over to study, it's pretty interesting actually, Israel's behavior in the Gaza war and the limits they had on the use of force. That is, they made all the time, of course, since the Hamas has a policy of basically putting the rocket launchers in civilian places. Israel has a whole doctrine about this and has people who have studied it a lot and gone to a million seminars on it and written it up, but also the actual commanders have to make really pretty much quick decisions sometimes about is it worth risking civilian casualties, what would be the right thing to do. I think the American generals went over and found out that the Israeli rules of engagement were stricter than the American rules of engagement in Iraq and Afghanistan, and the American generals thought a little too strict, actually, in terms of ultimately minimizing not just Israeli casualties, but actually even, you know, bringing the conflict to an end more quickly. So these are that would be an interesting thing to look at and to study, and it's not exactly a question of religion and foreign policy, but it certainly is a question of morality and the use of force. And it's quite sophisticated if you look at the discussions between these generals.